She stood at the altar in a dress she couldn't afford, marrying a man whose family wanted her gone. The room was silent. The vows were seconds away. And then his mother stood up. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it changed everything they thought they knew about love, money, and what it means to truly belong somewhere. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let me take you back to where this all began. This is a true story that unfolded in Charleston, South Carolina, in 2019. The names have been changed, but every detail you're about to hear actually happened. It's a story about two people from completely different worlds, a wedding that almost didn't happen, and a moment that exposed the truth about what we value most. By the end of this, you might find yourself asking what you would have done in their position. Would you have fought for love? Or would you have walked away? Keep that question in mind as we go deeper, because this story will test everything you think you know about class, dignity, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she grew up in a town most people only passed through on their way to somewhere better. It was one of those places where the gas station doubled as the grocery store, where everyone knew your business before you did, and where leaving felt more like a dream than a plan. Sarah's childhood home was a single wide trailer at the edge of town, the kind with aluminum siding that rattled when trucks drove by too fast. Her mother, Linda, worked the breakfast shift at a diner 6 days a week, coming home smelling like bacon grease and coffee, her feet swollen in shoes she'd owned for 5 years. Her father had left when Sarah was 4. No dramatic exit, no big fight. Just didn't come home one day. Linda never talked about him, and Sarah learned not to ask. What Sarah remembered most about growing up wasn't the lack of money, though there was plenty of that. It was the constant hum of anxiety that filled their home. The way her mother's jaw would tighten when the phone rang. The way they'd eat cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row without anyone mentioning it. The way Sarah learned to make herself small, to not need things, to be grateful for whatever came her way. She was a good student, not because learning came easy, but because school was the one place where hard work actually led somewhere. She graduated high school with decent grades and an acceptance letter to a community college 2 hours away. She studied nursing, worked part-time at a local hospital as a receptionist, and slowly built a life that felt stable, if not exactly comfortable. By the time she was 28, Sarah had become an ICU nurse at Charleston Medical Center. She lived in a small apartment she shared with a roommate, drove a 10-year-old Honda, and sent money home to her mother whenever she could. She didn't date much. Not because she wasn't interested, but because most of the men she met seemed to want someone lighter, someone who laughed easier, someone who hadn't spent their whole life bracing for disappointment. And then one evening in March, everything changed. Sarah had picked up an extra shift in the ICU that night. They were short-staffed, and she needed the overtime pay. Around 11 o'clock, the ambulance brought in a man in his early 60s who'd collapsed at a restaurant. Heart attack. His son arrived 20 minutes later, still in a suit from whatever event he'd been attending. His name was Daniel Whitmore, and Sarah noticed him immediately, not because he was handsome, though he was, but because of the way he carried himself into that sterile hospital hallway, like he was used to being in control, even when everything was falling apart. She was the one who updated him on his father's condition. She'd done this hundreds of times, delivering news to terrified family members, but something about Daniel made her slow down, choose her words more carefully. His father was stable but critical. The next 24 hours would tell them more. Daniel nodded, processing the information with the kind of composure that comes from years of being told emotions are a weakness. But his hands were shaking. Sarah noticed. She brought him coffee without him asking. Black, because that's what most people wanted when they were trying to stay alert. He looked surprised, then grateful. Over the next 3 days, while his father recovered, Daniel practically lived in that hospital waiting room. And somehow, in between medication updates and doctor consultations, he and Sarah started talking. Not the polite small talk strangers exchange in hospitals. Real conversations. He told her about growing up in a house with more rooms than people, about the pressure of carrying a family name that came with expectations he never asked for. She told him about her mother's diner shifts, about putting herself through nursing school, about the guilt of wanting more than the life you came from. They came from completely different worlds, but somehow, in that fluorescent lit waiting room, none of that seemed to matter. Daniel's father recovered and was discharged after a week. Sarah assumed that would be the end of it. People came into hospitals scared and vulnerable, formed temporary connections, then returned to their regular lives and forgot the nurse who held their hand. But Daniel didn't disappear. He came back to the hospital 3 days later with flowers, not for a patient, but for Sarah. He asked if she'd have coffee with him. She said yes, though part of her wondered if this was a mistake. Their first date was at a cafe near the hospital. He wore jeans and a sweater, clearly trying to dress down, and she wore the nicest dress she owned, a navy blue one from Target she'd bought 2 years ago. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about his work in commercial real estate, about the developments his family's company managed across the Southeast. She told him about the patients she'd lost, the ones she'd saved, and how some days she wasn't sure which hurt more. He didn't try to fix anything or offer easy answers. He just listened. They started seeing each other regularly after that. Dinners at restaurants where Sarah had to Google the menu beforehand to know what she was ordering. Weekend trips to places she'd only seen in magazines. But also simple things. Walks on the beach. Late-night conversations in his car. Mornings where he'd show up at her apartment with coffee and bagels before her shift. 6 months in, Sarah met his friends. They were polite, friendly even, but she could feel the questions underneath their smiles. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does she want from him? She didn't blame them. If she'd been in their position, she probably would have wondered the same thing. Daniel never seemed to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He introduced her to everyone with genuine pride, his hand always finding the small of her back, anchoring her to him. But Sarah noticed. She noticed the way conversations would pause when she mentioned where she grew up. The way people's eyes would flicker to her dress, her shoes, her lack of jewelry. The way they'd smile just a little too brightly when she talked about her job, like they were impressed she had one at all. It didn't hurt, exactly. It was more like a constant reminder that she didn't quite fit. But Daniel made it easy to forget. Around him, she felt like the person she'd always wanted to be. Confident. Worthy. Enough. 10 months into their relationship, Daniel took her to meet his parents. The Whitmore estate was everything Sarah had imagined and worse. A sprawling colonial mansion with white columns, manicured gardens, and the kind of driveway that curved like it was too good to go straight. She'd changed her outfit 4 times that morning, finally settling on a simple black dress and the one pair of pearl earrings she owned, a gift from her mother when she'd graduated nursing school. Daniel's mother, Catherine Whitmore, greeted them at the door. She was elegant in that effortless way wealthy women always seemed to be, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her smile polite but distant. His father, Richard, was recovering well from his heart attack, looking healthier than he had in the hospital. He shook Sarah's hand warmly, thanking her again for taking care of him. Catherine led them to the dining room, where a formal lunch had been prepared. Sarah counted 4 forks at her place setting and had a moment of panic before remembering to start from the outside and work her way in. The conversation was polite. Painfully polite. Catherine asked about Sarah's work, her family, where she'd gone to school. Each question felt like a test, and Sarah could feel herself being measured against some invisible standard she'd never be able to meet. She answered honestly, because what else could she do? She talked about her mother, about growing up in a small town, about why she'd chosen nursing. Catherine listened with the kind of attention that felt more like surveillance than interest. At one point, Daniel reached under the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. After lunch, while Daniel was showing his father something on his phone, Catherine asked Sarah if she'd like to see the garden. Sarah knew what this was. The private conversation. The real assessment. They walked through rows of roses, hydrangeas, and plants Sarah couldn't name. Catherine didn't waste time. She said Sarah seemed like a lovely person. She said Daniel clearly cared about her. And then she said the thing Sarah had been waiting for. She asked if Sarah had really thought about what a future with Daniel would look like. The scrutiny. The expectations. The fact that she'd always be the outsider, the one people whispered about, the one who didn't quite belong. Catherine wasn't cruel about it. That was almost worse. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who'd seen this story before and knew how it ended. She suggested, gently, that perhaps it would be kinder for everyone if Sarah thought carefully about whether this was really what she wanted, whether Daniel deserved to have his life complicated by someone who couldn't fully be part of his world. Sarah didn't tell Daniel about that conversation. What would she say? That his mother had politely suggested she wasn't good enough for him? That she'd felt like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed? She tried to pull back after that, to create some distance, but Daniel wouldn't let her. He showed up at her apartment, confused and hurt, asking what had changed. She couldn't lie to him. She told him everything. What his mother had said, how she felt. The constant sense that she was playing a game where everyone else knew the rules except her. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was sorry that his mother had made her feel that way. Sorry that his world came with so much baggage, but he wasn't sorry about loving her. And he wasn't going to let anyone, not even his family, tell him who he should be with. 2 weeks later, he proposed. Not at a fancy restaurant or some elaborate public display. In her apartment, on a Tuesday night, after they'd eaten takeout Chinese food and she was wearing sweatpants. He got down on one knee with a ring he'd had custom made, and he asked her to marry him. Sarah said yes. Of course she said yes. She loved him, but even as she said the word, part of her wondered if love would be enough. 3 months into their engagement, Sarah started feeling tired. More tired than usual. She chalked it up to working double shifts and wedding planning stress. But when the fatigue didn't go away, and she started feeling nauseous in the mornings, she took a pregnancy test. Positive. She sat on her bathroom floor for 20 minutes, staring at those 2 pink lines, trying to process what this meant. She and Daniel had talked about kids eventually, but eventually had always felt far away. This was now. This was real. And this was going to make everything exponentially more complicated. She told Daniel that evening. He was quiet at first, processing, and for a terrible moment Sarah wondered if this would be the thing that finally made him realize she was too much trouble. But then he smiled. A real smile. He said they'd figure it out. They always did. He was right. They would figure it out. But what neither of them anticipated was just how hard his family would fight to keep that from happening. A week after Sarah told Daniel about the pregnancy, she received a call from Catherine Whitmore. It wasn't a request to meet. It was a calm, polite instruction. Lunch, the following day, just the 2 of them. Sarah knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation, but she went anyway. They met at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place where people spoke in hushed tones and the menu didn't list prices. Catherine was already seated when Sarah arrived, composed and perfectly dressed as always. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She congratulated Sarah on the pregnancy with all the warmth of someone commenting on the weather, and then she got to the point. She said she'd been thinking a lot about Sarah's future. About the challenges she'd face marrying into a family like theirs. About how difficult it would be to raise a child in a world where Sarah would always be seen as different, lesser. She said she wanted to help. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check. Sarah didn't even need to look at the amount to know it was more money than she'd see in 5 years of nursing. Maybe 10. Catherine explained calmly. The money would be enough for Sarah to start over somewhere new. To raise her child comfortably. To build a life without the constant pressure of trying to fit into a world that would never fully accept her. All she had to do was end the engagement and leave Charleston. Daniel would be hurt at first, Catherine admitted, but he'd move on. He'd meet someone more suitable, someone who understood his world. And Sarah would have the financial security she'd never had growing up. Everyone would be better off. Sarah looked at that check for a long time. She thought about her mother's swollen feet after double shifts. About the anxiety that had hummed through her entire childhood. About the fact that with this money, she'd never have to worry about rent or bills or whether she could afford to fix her car. But she also thought about Daniel. About the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. About the way he listened when she talked, really listened. About the life they were building together, messy and complicated and real. She slid the check back across the table. She told Catherine she appreciated the offer, but she wasn't interested. She loved Daniel. And she wasn't going to walk away just because his family thought she wasn't good enough. Catherine's expression didn't change. She simply nodded, took the check back, and said she hoped Sarah wouldn't regret her decision. The threat was clear, even if the words weren't. The months leading up to the wedding were harder than Sarah expected. Daniel's family didn't cut them off completely. That would have been too obvious, too cruel. Instead, they made everything difficult in small, subtle ways. The venue they'd originally booked suddenly had scheduling conflicts. The photographer Daniel's mother had recommended became unavailable. Invitations to family events stopped coming. Daniel noticed, of course. He apologized constantly, tried to smooth things over, but there was only so much he could do. His father, Richard, was more sympathetic than Catherine. He'd pull Daniel aside, tell him he just wanted him to be happy, but even he couldn't fully break ranks with his wife. Sarah's mother, Linda, flew in 2 weeks before the wedding. It was the first time she'd seen where Sarah lived, met Daniel, experienced this new life her daughter had built. Linda was overwhelmed by all of it. The wealth, the tension, the sense that her daughter was fighting a battle she couldn't see clearly. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Linda and Sarah sat on the small balcony of Sarah's apartment. Linda asked her daughter if she was sure, really sure. Not about loving Daniel, Linda could see that was real. But about whether she was ready for a lifetime of being made to feel like she didn't belong. Sarah didn't have a good answer. She just knew she couldn't imagine her life without Daniel in it. The wedding was scaled down from what Daniel had originally planned. Fewer guests. A smaller venue. His mother had insisted on maintaining some traditions, some appearances, but Sarah could feel the judgment underneath every detail. On the morning of the wedding, Sarah woke up in a hotel room with her mother beside her and her baby moving inside her. She was 4 months pregnant now, just starting to show. The dress she'd chosen had enough room to hide it, but she knew people would notice eventually. Would talk. She'd stopped caring what they thought weeks ago. Or at least, she'd stopped letting it control her decisions. Her mother helped her into her dress, a simple ivory gown with lace sleeves and a flowing skirt. Nothing too expensive. Nothing that would make Catherine Whitmore roll her eyes at her son's choice of bride trying to look like she belonged. Linda kissed her daughter's forehead and told her she was proud of her. That she'd always fought for what mattered. That she was braver than she knew. The ceremony was held at a historic chapel in downtown Charleston. Oak pews, stained glass windows. The kind of place that had witnessed 100 years of vows and promises and families joining together. Sarah walked down the aisle alone. Her father wasn't there to give her away, and she'd insisted she didn't need a stand-in. She could walk into her own future on her own 2 feet. Daniel was waiting for her at the altar, and when their eyes met, everything else fell away for just a moment. The judgmental guests. The whispers. The knowledge that half the people in this room didn't think she belonged here. None of it mattered. The officiant began the ceremony. Traditional vows. Nothing too personal, nothing that would give people more ammunition to gossip about later. Sarah could feel Catherine Whitmore's eyes on her from the front row, could sense the disapproval radiating across the pews. And then came the moment. The question every wedding has, though most people expect it to pass without incident. The officiant said, in a voice that carried through the silent chapel, "If anyone has any reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace." Sarah had been to enough weddings to know this was usually just a formality. No one ever actually objected. But this time, someone stood up. Catherine Whitmore rose from her seat in the front row. The entire chapel went silent. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. Daniel's hand tightened around hers. This was it. The moment his mother would finally say what she'd been thinking all along. That Sarah wasn't good enough. That this wedding was a mistake. That Daniel was throwing his life away. Catherine walked forward slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stopped a few feet from the altar and looked at Sarah. Really looked at her. And then she spoke. Catherine's voice was clear and steady when she spoke. She said, "I need to say something before this goes any further." The room was so quiet Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Catherine continued. 3 months ago, I offered this woman money to leave my son's life. A significant amount of money. Enough to change her entire future. Gasps rippled through the chapel. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Of course Catherine would do this. Of course she'd humiliate her in front of everyone. But Catherine wasn't finished. She refused, Catherine said, and her voice caught slightly. She refused because she understood something I'd forgotten. Something I'd let my fear and my pride overshadow. She turned to look at Daniel now. Your father had a heart attack 10 months ago. In that hospital, scared and vulnerable, I watched a nurse treat him with more dignity and compassion than I've seen in our social circles in 30 years. That nurse was Sarah. She didn't know who we were. She didn't know what we had. She just cared. Catherine turned back to Sarah. I've spent these months trying to protect my son from what I thought was a mistake. I was wrong. I was protecting him from the wrong thing. I should have been protecting him from people like me. People who think money and status matter more than character and kindness. Tears were streaming down Catherine's face now. I've spent my whole life in a world where love is conditional. Where everything has a price. where people are valued for what they bring to the table, not who they are. And I was so afraid my son would make the wrong choice that I couldn't see he was making the only right one. She looked at Sarah directly. I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry for making you feel unwelcome. For trying to buy you off. For not seeing what my son saw from the beginning. That you are exactly the kind of person this family needs. Catherine stepped back. The chapel remained silent for a long moment. Then she returned to her seat, and the officiant, looking slightly stunned, continued with the ceremony. Sarah and Daniel exchanged their vows with tears in their eyes, not the sad kind, the kind that comes from relief, from unexpected grace, from watching something broken begin to heal. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause was genuine, not the polite clapping of obligation, but real celebration. At the reception, Catherine approached Sarah while Daniel was talking to his father. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine said quietly, I meant what I said in there. All of it. Sarah nodded. I know. I'd like to try again, Catherine continued. If you'll let me, I'd like to know my grandchild. I'd like to be the kind of mother-in-law who deserves a daughter like you. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. That would take time, but the beginning of it. The possibility. I'd like that too, Sarah said. 6 months later, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Emma. Catherine was there in the hospital, holding Linda's hand in the waiting room, two grandmothers from completely different worlds united by love for the same child. Over the years, Catherine did try, really try. She learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. She volunteered at the hospital where Sarah worked, spending time with patients who had no family, no visitors, giving the same kind of care she'd once taken for granted. She never forgot the check she'd offered Sarah, and she never stopped being grateful it had been refused. Because that refusal had taught her something she'd needed to learn. That the things worth having are the things you can't buy. That real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or property or social standing. It's measured in how you treat people when you have the power to hurt them and choose kindness instead. Sarah and Daniel's marriage wasn't perfect. No marriage is. But it was real. Built on a foundation of choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Sarah never forgot where she came from. She still sent money to her mother every month, still worked as a nurse, despite Daniel insisting she didn't have to, still drove the same 10-year-old Honda until it literally wouldn't start anymore. She never let wealth change the core of who she was, and Daniel never asked her to. He'd fallen in love with a woman who knew what it meant to work for everything she had, who understood that dignity wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned through how you treated people when no one was watching. Their daughter Emma grew up understanding both worlds, the privilege she'd been born into and the struggle her mother had overcome to get there. They made sure of that. Made sure she knew that her last name opened doors, but her character determined whether she deserved to walk through them. And Catherine kept her promise. She became the grandmother Emma deserved, and slowly, year by year, she became the mother-in-law Sarah had once thought impossible. Not perfect, but present. Trying. And sometimes, that's all love really is. The choice to keep trying, even when you've failed before. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you before they knew you? Where you were made to feel like you didn't belong, like you weren't enough? What did you do? Did you walk away, or did you stand your ground? And if you'd been Sarah, sitting across from Catherine with that check on the table, what would you have chosen? Would you have taken the money and the security, or would you have refused it for love? There's no right answer. Life isn't that simple. But I think Sarah's story reminds us that the most valuable things in life are the ones you can't put a price on. The courage to be yourself in rooms that don't want you there. The strength to choose love even when the world makes it hard. The wisdom to know that real wealth isn't about what you have, it's about who you become. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life and the choices you've made, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. Tell us your story. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter, the ones that remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for watching.